On the morning that the bells stopped ringing for the dead, Margaret Ashford knew the world had changed forever. For 3 years, the tolling had been constant, a relentless soundtrack to grief that had become so familiar it had almost ceased to sound like death at all. It had become merely the rhythm of life, the background hum of a civilization learning to number its losses in the thousands, then the tens of thousands. But on that gray October morning in 1351, when she woke to silence, Margaret understood that something fundamental had shifted. The silence itself was the sound of transition, of a wound beginning to scar over, of a people preparing to remember how to live. She sat on the edge of her cot in the small cottage she'd inherited from her brother Thomas, who'd fallen ill one bitter February morning and been gone by nightfall, and listened to the silence. Outside, the village of Thornwick was already stirring. She could hear old John the blacksmith pumping his bellows again, something he'd abandoned for months after he'd lost his wife and 3 of his 4 children. The regular rhythm of his work was almost shocking in its normalcy. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The plague had come to Thornwick in the autumn of 1348, arriving on a merchant's cart from Bristol, like an uninvited guest who would never leave. In those early days, no one had understood what it truly was. The monks at the monastery spoke of God's judgment. The physician who still lived in the village, a man named Cromwell, who detrained in Oxford before wisdom had evacuated him of his certainty, spoke of bad air and humors and the alignment of planets. The old women whispered of curses and witchcraft. No one spoke the simple truth, that death had come to visit, and he was keeping an open door. Margaret had been 28 years old when it began, a widow of 2 years, following the death of her husband, Edmund, who'd been thrown from a horse while traveling on business for the lord of the manor. She had no children, no remarriage prospects. Edmund had left her with a small cottage and a smaller income, enough to sustain her, but not enough to make her interesting to potential suitors. She was, in the eyes of the world, a woman waiting to fade, and this suited her well enough. She had her books, her garden, her embroidery, and the quiet respect of those who understood her to be respectable and unobtrusive. The first victim in Thornwick had been a child named William, the son of the village blacksmith. He'd been 6 years old, a bright-eyed boy with his father's dark curls and his mother's mischievous smile. Margaret had seen him 2 days before he fell ill, running through the market with a wooden horse that John had carved for him. 3 days after he fell ill, he was dead. And 3 days after that, his mother had begun to burn with fever. Within a fortnight, the death count had risen to 7. Within a month, it was nearly 30. Within 3 months, Thornwick, a village that had numbered perhaps 800 souls, had lost nearly 200 of them. The cottage next to Margaret's had belonged to a family called Pembroke. They were good people. The father worked as a tanner. The mother was known for her kindness. They had 4 children ranging from 2 to 14. Margaret had waved to them in the mornings, had shared vegetables from her garden when hers failed, had occasionally attended the same church services. But she had not been intimately connected to them. She was not their close friend or family member. When sickness came, she thought of them with pity, but it was the pity of the uninvolved. Then one morning, Thomas had knocked on her door. Thomas was 5 years older than Margaret, a merchant by trade, who'd done well enough to build a good house in a nearby town and to marry a respectable woman named Catherine. They had 3 children together, and Thomas had been something of a success in the world, not wealthy, but comfortable. He arrived at Margaret's cottage, looking exhausted and anxious, his usually neat appearance disheveled, his eyes darting about as if he couldn't quite focus on anything. "I need you to come," he'd said without preamble. "Catherine is ill, and the servants have all run away. I don't know what to do. The children are frightened." I can't manage them alone." Margaret had no experience with illness, no training as a nurse, no particular aptitude for tending to the sick. But she had packed a small bag anyway, had left her cottage in the care of a neighbor, and had gone with Thomas back to his house. What she found there was something that belonged more to hell than to the living world. Catherine was in the upstairs bedroom, covered in a thin linen shift, despite the cold of the house, burning with fever. Her skin had taken on a strange, darkened quality in places, and in her neck and under her arms great swellings had begun to form, black as rotted fruit and leaking foul pus. The smell was overwhelming, not the clean smell of healthy sweat, but something corrupted and ancient, like the stench of a battlefield left unburied for weeks. The 3 children were below stairs, huddled in the kitchen around a dying fire. The youngest, a girl named Anne, who was only 4, was crying quietly. The middle child, Edmund, named after Margaret's late husband, was silent and staring, his small face blank with shock. The oldest, Richard, was a boy of 9 years, and he was trying very hard to be brave and failing with a boy's inevitable heartbreak. The physician said she would recover, Thomas told Margaret, and there was a note of desperation in his voice that broke her heart. He said if we kept her cool and bled her properly, she would recover, but she's worse. She's so much worse. Catherine died 3 days later. By then, young Edmund had begun to burn with fever as well. Margaret stayed. She didn't consciously decide to do so. She simply looked at Thomas's devastated face and the children's terrified eyes and found that her legs would not carry her toward the door. Someone needed to tend Catherine's body. Someone needed to try to care for Edmund. Someone needed to be present so that Richard and Anne would know that the world still contained adults who cared, whether they lived or died. For the next 6 days, while Catherine's body grew cold and Edmund's grew hot with fever, Margaret worked without sleeping more than an hour or 2 at a time. She bathed Edmund's skin with cool water drawn from the well. She tried to get him to drink small sips of weak broth, though he rarely opened his eyes. She held Richard's hand when the boy couldn't sleep from fear. She rocked Anne, singing softly the songs her own mother had sung to her decades ago. Among the survivors of the plague, there was sometimes a strange kind of status sense that death had marked you and found you wanting, and therefore you must be someone of significance in God's eyes. Margaret found herself regarded with a new kind of respect. When old John the blacksmith's daughter fell ill, his wife came to Margaret for advice. When Margaret suggested that Margaret come and stay with them, to help nurse the girl and to use whatever mysterious protection had saved Margaret, they welcomed her with something close to gratitude. The girl died anyway, but not before 3 days of comfort, of a cool hand on her burning forehead, of someone sitting in the darkness and speaking to her so she wouldn't be alone. The blacksmith's wife told Margaret afterward that it had mattered, that knowing her daughter had someone with her had made the difference between grief and unbearable grief, and perhaps there was no practical difference, but it mattered nonetheless. Margaret began to spend more of her time moving through the village, present to the dying, present to the grieving, present to the living who were struggling with the weight of continuing to exist. She did this not because she'd made any grand decision to serve the afflicted. She did it because she was present, and because when someone was dying alone, she couldn't make herself leave. She did it because the alternative was to sit in her cottage and think about Thomas in London, and about Catherine and Edmund and Anne, and about the boy William and his mother, and about all the others, the dozens and dozens of others, whom she'd known or had seen in the village and who were now gone. By the middle of 1350, the plague's fury had somewhat diminished, though it had not departed. The initial wave of deaths had been so swift and so overwhelming that the disease had, in a sense, run through the population and exhausted the easy prey. What remained was a slower burn, new cases appearing here and there, but rarely the mass die-offs that had characterized the first terrible year. The village had adjusted in the way that humans adjust to anything given enough time. The dead had been buried. Some of the houses had been reclaimed by survivors or abandoned entirely. New structures of authority had begun to form on the young lord and a council of the oldest surviving residents. Work had resumed. The rhythms of agriculture continued, because without agriculture, everyone would starve, plague or no plague. Margaret was 31 years old, and she had become something that didn't quite have a name in the social structure of Thornwick. She was neither a lady nor a servant, neither fully integrated into a family nor wholly separate from everyone. She was, perhaps, essential. When the young lord needed someone to assess the welfare of various households and report back, he sent Margaret. When someone fell ill and their family didn't know what to do, they sent for Margaret. When decisions needed to be made about which abandoned houses might be reclaimed or which fields might be planted, the council consulted Margaret. She had not chosen this role. It had simply accrued to her as a result of survival and the accident of her prior circumstances. But she had come to value it. She was not building a dynasty. She was not accumulating power or wealth. But she was preventing some small measure of suffering, and in a world that had been stripped down to its essential functions, that seemed like sufficient purpose. It was in the autumn of 1350, as she was making her rounds, checking on various households to assess the village's stores for the coming winter, that Margaret first saw the woman in the window. The cottage was one she recognized. It had belonged to a family called Webster, a father and mother and 6 children. They had been decimated by the plague. The father had gone first, then the mother, then 5 of the 6 children over the course of 2 horrible weeks in January of 1349. The sole surviving child, a girl named Elizabeth, who'd been 14 at the time of the plague's arrival, had fled rather than stay in the cottage alone. Or so everyone had assumed. Margaret was walking past, on her way to check on old John the blacksmith and confirm that his stores were adequate, when she noticed something in the window of the Webster cottage. A candle, a simple tallow candle burning in the window, though it was barely past midday, and there was no reason to light a candle at such an hour. Margaret stopped and stared at the candle. She was fairly certain the cottage had been empty for well over a year. She'd walked past it countless times and had seen no sign of occupation, but someone had lit a candle. She approached the door and knocked. There was a long moment of silence. Then a voice, young and female and trembling with fear. "Who's there?" "My name is Margaret Ashford," Margaret called through the door. "I live in the village. Who are you?" Another silence. Then, "I can't let anyone in. I have food, and I'm all right." "You don't need to come inside." Margaret recognized the voice. It was Elizabeth Webster, though changed by fear into something that seemed older and younger at the same time. "Elizabeth? It's Margaret Ashford, from near the market. I knew your family." The door opened a crack, and an eye appeared, suspicious and cautious. Then it opened wider. Elizabeth Webster had been 14 years old when the plague arrived. Now, nearly 2 years later, she was 16, and the plague had burned away her childhood in a way that nothing else could have. She was thin, far thinner than a healthy young girl should be, and her hair was wild, as if she hadn't combed it in weeks. But it was her eyes that struck Margaret most profoundly. They were old eyes, the eyes of someone who'd seen too much and had made terrible choices to survive, and was now living with the consequences. "I came back," Elizabeth said without preamble. "I left with my aunt, but she had no food, and her family couldn't spare any for me. They said, they said, there wasn't enough. So I came back here. There's food stored in the cellar. My mother hid things. Smoked meat, dried vegetables, grain. I found them. I've been living here. For how long? Since summer? 4 months, maybe. I didn't know if it was safe to be seen. I thought people would think that I carried the sickness because everyone else is dead. So I stayed inside. Margaret looked at the young girl, living alone in a dead house for 4 months, too afraid to be seen, too afraid to seek help, too afraid of what the world might think of a girl who had the terrible luck to survive when her entire family had not. "The candle in the window," Margaret said. "Why?" Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "So someone would know I was here, so I wouldn't be completely alone. It's just a candle, a ... She gestured helplessly. "If someone was looking, they would know that someone was here, that I was here." Margaret felt her heart break a little, in a way that was becoming familiar, but no less painful. She thought of all the candles that might have been lit in windows across the plague-stricken landscape, signals sent out into darkness, saying, "We are here. We are alive. We have not been erased entirely." "You're not alone anymore," Margaret said. "Come, let me help you. The village needs to know you're alive." "They'll blame me," Elizabeth said. "They'll say I brought the plague." "They won't," Margaret said, though she couldn't be entirely certain of this. "You're a survivor. The village is full of survivors now. There's no shame in it." It took some convincing, but eventually Margaret managed to get Elizabeth to agree to let her help. She brought the girl food from her own stores, fresh bread and dried meat and cheese. She brought clean clothes. She sat with Elizabeth and listened to her account of the 2 years since her family's death, the refugee with her aunt's family, the slow starvation of being told repeatedly that she was one mouth too many, the desperation that had driven her to creep back into her dead parents' house and to hide there like a hunted animal. Over the following weeks, Margaret helped bring Elizabeth back into the village. It was not without difficulty. Some people were suspicious of the girl's sudden reappearance. Some whispered that she'd carried the plague to her own family, though this made no sense chronologically. But gradually, the village adjusted. Elizabeth was young and healthy and capable of work. These were commodities more valuable than gossip, and so she was slowly accepted back into the community. She took over her parents' cottage. She began to garden, to work, to participate in the daily rhythms of Thornwick. She was no longer a ghost haunting the dead. She was a person participating in the work of the living. And Margaret realized something as she watched this young girl return to life. The candle in the window hadn't just been a signal for others. It had been a signal for herself, a way of saying, "I am here. I matter. I will not be erased by the plague, even if everyone I love has been." The autumn turned to winter, and the winter grew cold. 1350 bled into 1351, and something shifted in the landscape. The plague was not gone. It would never be entirely gone, would return in waves for decades to come, but it had passed its zenith. The immediate slaughter had ceased. What remained was recovery and recollection, the work of figuring out how to be human when everything human had been stripped away. In Thornwick, this took various forms. Some people tried to forget, to push past what had happened and build something new. Some people were consumed by memory, unable to move past the losses they'd endured. Some people tried to find meaning in their survival, concluding that God must have spared them for a purpose. Some simply tried to get through each day without thinking too much about the fact that nearly 3/4 of the people they'd known were now dead. Margaret found herself in a curious position. She was neither wealthy nor poor, neither powerful nor powerless. She had survived the plague, not because of any particular virtue, but through the random operation of chance. And now she was present in the village as something like a living reminder that life could continue, even after everything. It was in the spring of 1351 that the young lord, whose name was Thomas, a name that carried weight for Margaret after her brother, called her to his manor. The lord's manor had been partially cleaned up after years of neglect. Most of the rooms were still empty, still bearing the scars of the plague, but Thomas had reclaimed his father's study and several of the bedchambers. He was 18 years old, tall and thin, with a kind of nervous energy that suggested a boy who'd been forced to become a man too quickly, who still had more than a little boy inside him. "I want to rebuild," he told Margaret straight away, without preamble. Not rebuild in the same way as before. Different. Better, if possible. But I don't know how to do this. I don't know what's needed. "I thought maybe you could advise me." Margaret was startled. "I'm not qualified to advise on such matters, my lord." "No," he agreed. "You're not. But you know the people of Thornwick. You know what they need. You've been moving among them, keeping them alive, keeping them sane. I've seen what you do. Even though you don't know, I've been watching. You have a gift for seeing what's needed and making it happen. I need that gift applied to Thornwick itself." Over the following months, Margaret and the young lord worked together to create a plan for the village's recovery. They decided to establish a community grain store, something that would ensure no one starved during the next winter and could provide seed for the spring planting. They decided to repair the village church, not out of any particular religious fervor, but because it was the one place where the village came together, and it needed to be a place that inspired rather than depressed. They established a system for tracking who had land and who needed land, who had animals and who needed animals, who had skills and who needed to learn skills. They brought in a new priest from a neighboring village, an older man, less certain of his theology, but more certain of his basic kindness than the previous priest had been. They even managed to secure a physician, though this was a smaller accomplishment. He was a younger man, with less training but more willingness to stay in a place marked by plague. And in the autumn of 1351, when the bells began not to ring for the dead quite so frequently, Margaret realized that something had genuinely shifted. She was in the marketplace on an ordinary Tuesday, trading some of her preserved vegetables for a length of cloth from the weaver, when she noticed all the candles. There was one in the window of the marketplace itself, one in the cottage next to it, one in the window of the blacksmith's shop, one in the home of the carpenter, one in the church, visible even in the late afternoon light. She walked slowly through the village, counting the candles. There were perhaps 40 of them now, placed in windows throughout Thornwick. They served no practical purpose. There was no urgent signal to be given, no need to warn anyone of anything. But they were there nonetheless. She asked young Thomas about them at their next meeting. "I don't know exactly when it started," he said. "About 6 weeks ago, I think. I noticed one first at Elizabeth's cottage, the girl you brought back. Just a single candle in the window. I wondered what it meant. Then the next week, there was another one at the baker's house, and another at the smithy. I asked about it, and the baker's wife said something about remembering, about honoring the dead while we live. After that, more and more people started putting candles in their windows." "It's beautiful," Margaret said. "It is," Thomas agreed. "It's like the whole village is saying, 'We are here, we are alive, and we remember.'" All at once. That night, Margaret returned to her cottage and, for the first time since the plague had begun, lit a candle and placed it in her window. She didn't place it there as a signal to anyone else. She placed it for herself, for the people she'd lost, her husband Edmund, her brother Thomas Catherine, and her 3 children, William and his mother, and all the others whose names she could no longer quite remember, but whose deaths she could feel like a weight on her heart. The candle burned bright in the window, a small flame pushing back against darkness, making no grand claims, asking nothing, simply existing as a beacon and a memorial. From that night onward, she lit it every evening as the sun set, and she never allowed it to go out. Thomas tried to help, but grief had hollowed him out into something that looked like a man, but wasn't quite one anymore. He would stand in the doorways of rooms and stare at nothing. Sometimes he would speak to his dead wife, as if she were still there. Sometimes he wept, though even his tears seemed to come from a distant place, remote and detached from his conscious mind. On the 7th day, Edmund stopped burning. His fever broke, and for a few hours, Margaret and Thomas dared to hope. but the damage was done. The swellings that had covered his small body, his neck, his armpits, his groin, his fingers and toes, had begun to turn gangrenous. He developed a rasping cough. By evening, blood was streaming from his nose. He died just before dawn, his small hand in Margaret as she whispered to him that he was brave and good and loved. She wasn't certain he could hear her, but she spoke the words anyway, because silence seemed like a betrayal, and someone needed to bear witness to his passing, even if he could not bear witness to it himself. Thomas came into the room just after Anne had breathed her last. He stood there, looking down at his son, the dark-haired boy who had been his hope, his future, his particular pride, and something in him simply broke. It was not a sound or a dramatic gesture. It was the breaking of a thing that had already been fractured by Catherine's death, and now had shattered entirely into pieces that no one would ever quite be able to put back together. "Go," he said to Margaret. His voice was flat and empty. "You've done what you can. Go back to your cottage. There's nothing left to do here." "Thomas, go," he repeated. And then, in a voice so soft she almost didn't hear it, "I can't bear to see your face anymore. It's too good, too kind. I can't bear it." Margaret left the house and returned to her cottage. She was covered in blood and pus and other fluids. She burned the clothes she'd been wearing. She scrubbed her skin raw with lye soap and water, so hot it left her hands red and blistered. And 3 days later, Thomas came to see her. She barely recognized him. He looked as if he'd aged 10 years in those 3 days. His hair seemed to have gone grayer. His skin had a translucent quality, as if he were already becoming a ghost. "I'm leaving Thornwick," he told her. "I'm leaving today. I'm going to stay with Catherine's sister in London. I can't stay here. Every room in that house is full of them. I can see them. I can smell them. If I stay one more night, I think I'll follow them." "Thomas, you need rest. You need time. I need them to be alive again," he said, and the look in his eyes was so desolate that Margaret found she had no words at all. "That's what I need. And since I can't have that, I need to run away." He embraced her briefly, and she felt how thin he'd become, how hollow. Then he was gone, and Margaret was alone in her cottage once more. She didn't know it then, but that was the beginning of the end. Not the end of the plague that would go on for months yet, and then return in waves for years to come, but the end of hope that it could somehow be managed, controlled, survived as a group. What came after Thomas left was simply endurance, person by person, cottage by cottage, the slow addition of candles lit in windows, marking not hope anymore, but merely the fact of survival. By the winter of 1349, Thornwick was a village of ghosts and the people who haunted it. The physical structure of the place hadn't changed. The church still stood, its ancient stone defiant against the plague. The marketplace still existed, though the stalls were now frequently empty. The roads were the same dirt roads they'd always been. But something essential had evacuated the place, and what remained was a kind of living death. A population had fallen to perhaps 200 people. Some had fled, as Thomas had, taking their chances on the roads and in distant towns. Some had barricaded themselves in their homes and refused to let anyone in, hoping that isolation could be a fortress against death. Most had simply stayed and survived, or not survived, as the plague decided. The social structures of the village had more or less dissolved. The lord of the manor had died. His wife and his primary heir had died. His remaining son, a boy barely 17, had inherited the title and the land, but he was too young and too frightened to exercise much authority. Besides, what authority could matter when God himself seemed to be executing judgment? The priest had died. The physician had fled. The few people who held power before the plague now held only their own survival in their hands, and even that grip was precarious. Margaret discovered, somewhat to her surprise, that she was one of the more capable people remaining in Thornwick. This was not because she was exceptional in any way. It was simply that she had none of the impediments that made others less capable. She had no children to protect with every fiber of her being. She had no husband whose needs had to come before her own. She had no employer to answer to. She had a small income that had proven sufficient to survive on most of the economic structures, had broken down enough that currency mattered far less than the ability to grow food or the willingness to trade goods, and she had survived the plague. She wasn't immune, no one truly was. But in the spring of 1349, 4 months after Thomas had left, and 7 months into the plague's occupation of Thornwick, Margaret had woken up ill. Her fever had been terrible. She'd developed the black swellings. She'd spent 3 days certain she was dying, waiting for the final dissolution. But on the 4th day, her fever had broken. On the 5th day, she'd been able to stand without her legs giving out from under her. On the 7th day, she'd managed to walk to the well and back. She lived. No one knew why some people lived and some died. The physician had theories, bad humors, the disposition of the stars, the will of God. But these were theories offered from the safe distance of a man who already fled the village and intended never to return. Margaret had no theories. She simply knew that she had been sick, and now she was not sick, and she was grateful for that fact with a gratitude that went deeper than words. Over the following months, as winter approached and then came, and as the candles multiplied throughout Thornwick until nearly every cottage had one burning in its window, Margaret began to understand something about hope. Hope, she realized, was not the same thing as optimism or cheerfulness. Hope was not the expectation that everything would be fine, or that the loss could be reversed, or that suffering had some ultimate meaning that would be revealed in time. Hope was something quieter and more stubborn than that. Hope was the decision to continue. It was the choice to light a candle even when the darkness was overwhelming. It was the willingness to plant seeds in spring, knowing that everything you planted might fail. It was the commitment to another person, knowing that they might die, knowing that death might take them at any moment and without warning. It was, in essence, the decision that life was worth living anyway, even after everything, even with the knowledge of what loss could be. Margaret saw this hope in various forms throughout Thornwick. She saw it in old John the blacksmith, who had lost his wife and 3 of his 4 children, and who nonetheless had begun to joke again, to laugh at small things, to take pride in the quality of his work. She saw it in Elizabeth Webster, the girl who had hidden for 4 months in her dead parents' house, and who was now slowly beginning to smile, beginning to make friends with other young people in the village, beginning to imagine a future that contained more than survival. She saw it in Thomas, the young lord, who had inherited a decimated estate and was working to build something new, not trying to recreate what had been lost, but creating something different, something perhaps better suited to a world that had been fundamentally transformed. And she saw it in the candles. Every evening, as darkness fell, the candles were lit. Some were simple tallow, creating just enough light to mark their presence. Some were taller, burning longer, marking a household that had managed to accumulate a little more wealth, a little more stability. But all of them burned with the same fundamental message. We are here, we have survived, and we carry forward the memory of those who did not. It was in December of 1351, as Christmas approached for the first time since the height of the plague, that Margaret realized the village was going to have a celebration. No one had explicitly decided this. There had been no proclamation from the young lord, no announcement by the priest. But gradually, people began to prepare. The butcher, who had survived, and who was slowly rebuilding his trade, prepared special cuts of meat. The carpenter began constructing a simple stage in the marketplace. What is this for? Just songs, maybe some stories, a market day where we can trade and talk. Since before the plague, Margaret said. Yes, the carpenter agreed. On Christmas Eve, Thornwick held its festival. It was modest by any objective measure. There was no elaborate decoration, no exotic goods, no great wealth on display. But there was music-old songs that people had been afraid to sing, because singing required the presence of joy, and joy had seemed like a betrayal of the dead. There were stories. There was food shared among the community, which had been unthinkable for many months. Margaret stood at the edge of the market, watching as the village moved through the evening. She saw Elizabeth Webster dancing with two other young women. Her thin face flushed with a kind of happiness that Margaret had never seen on a plague survivor's face before. She saw old John the blacksmith with his surviving son, their heads bent together in conversation, and even from a distance she could sense something like peace between them. In the windows of every cottage and shop, burning steadily, marking the presence of the people who were alive and present, honoring the memory of those who were not. As night fell fully and the stars came out, Margaret found herself walking slowly through the festival, through the marketplace she'd known her entire life. So much had changed. She thought about Thomas, her brother, who'd run to London and whom she'd never heard from again. She thought about the boy William and his mother. She thought about Catherine and her 3 children. She thought about all the others, the dozens and dozens of others, whose names and faces were fading, now being worn smooth by time, becoming less a specific grief and more a general sadness, like a river stone that had been tumbled in the current until it no longer remembered the sharp edges it had once possessed. And she thought about the candles, and about the choice they represented, the choice to continue, to remember, to build something new on the rubble of what had been destroyed. Later that evening, as the festival was winding down and people were beginning to drift back to their homes, Margaret noticed that young Thomas was standing by himself, looking up at the sky. She approached him. "It was a good celebration," she said. "It was," he agreed. "It was needed, I think. Not to forget. I don't think we're meant to forget, but to remind ourselves that we can still have moments of lightness, I suppose. That joy isn't a betrayal of those who died. Or if it is, it's a betrayal worth committing." "Do you think the village will survive?" Margaret asked. "Not just survive, but actually recover?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I think we'll become something different," he said finally. "Not what we were before. The plague took that from us. But we'll become something, and it will have its own kind of goodness. We're not the same people who lived here before. How could we be? But we're still people. We still want to live. And that's something." They stood together in the darkness, watching the candles burning in the windows, watching the stars emerge from the clouds, watching the village slowly settle into sleep. And Margaret felt something that she'd almost stopped feeling during the plague, a kind of tentative peace. Not the peace of someone who'd found answers, not the peace of someone who'd stopped hurting, but the peace of someone who de-learned to carry their pain without allowing it to carry them away. The candles continued to burn through the winter of 1351 and into the spring of 1352. As the weather warmed and the possibility of another growing season became apparent, the village began to plan for the future in a way that hadn't been quite possible before. The fields that had lain fallow for so long were plowed again. Seeds were planted. New structures were built, houses for people who had lost their homes, cottages for those who needed to establish themselves anew. Margaret continued her work, moving through the village, offering help where it was needed, simply being present to the people who were trying to rebuild their lives. But she noticed that the need for her was gradually changing. She was no longer essential in the same way. People were becoming more self-sufficient, more connected to each other through bonds that didn't depend on her presence. It was a good change, she knew, even though it meant that the particular role she played during the plague's worst years was becoming less necessary. She had never sought that role, had never wanted to be indispensable, and yet there was something bittersweet about being needed less. One afternoon in late April, as Margaret was walking through the village, she encountered Elizabeth Webster, carrying a large basket of seedlings bound for the fields. "Margaret!" Elizabeth called out, her face bright with genuine warmth. "Have you seen the new saplings that the Lord is having planted along the road toward the market? They're apple trees, mostly, but also some pear. He says that in 10 years, the whole road will be lined with fruit trees. Can you imagine? Something that takes 10 years to grow. That's a beautiful thing," Margaret said. "It shows faith in the future." "It does," Elizabeth agreed. "I've been thinking, I want to help with that project. Not just the planting, but the tending of them over time. I want to be the person who watches them grow. Is that strange? After everything, I want to put my effort into something that won't be ready until I'm much older. It's like saying, I will be here in 10 years. I will still be here." Margaret felt something catch in her chest, that sweet, painful recognition of a person learning to hope again. "That's not strange at all. That's the most human thing I've heard in a very long time." As she walked away, Margaret understood that Elizabeth would be fine. The girl had moved from survival into something that resembled life again. And this was what recovery looked like, not the erasure of the plague or the forgetting of the dead, but the slow reassertion of the future as something worth investing in. Over the following weeks, Margaret found herself with more time to herself than she'd had in years. The village didn't need her constant presence anymore. People had learned to manage their own affairs. New structures of community had formed that didn't depend on her unique position as a survivor who seemed to have both wisdom and compassion. She returned to her cottage and spent time in her garden, which had grown wild during the years of the plague. She began to tend it properly again, planting vegetables and flowers, restoring it to something like what it had been before Edmund had died and before she'd become, a kind of wandering guardian of the afflicted. And in the evenings, she continued to light her candle and place it in the window. But something had shifted in why she lit it. It was no longer a memorial alone, though it was that too. It had become a kind of practice, a ritual that anchored her to the day and to the community she was part of. It was a way of saying, this day has passed, and I am still here. Tomorrow will come, and I will still be here. It was in May that Margaret received an unexpected visitor. She was in her garden, kneeling in the soil, planting late-season peas, when she heard a horse approaching on the road. Visitors to her cottage were rare people generally came looking for her rather than her coming to them, and she was curious about who this might be. She stood and brushed the dirt from her skirts and walked toward the cottage. A man was dismounting from a warm-looking horse, a man of perhaps 40 years, with graying hair and the kind of deep lines in his face that spoke of long years of difficult travel. She didn't recognize him at first, but then, as he looked up at her, something in his face became familiar, a particular set to his jaw, a shade of blue in his eyes that she'd seen before. "Thomas," she said, and her voice broke on the name. Her brother stood there looking at her, as if she might disappear if he looked away. "You're alive, as are you," she said, and found that she was crying, though she didn't quite remember starting to cry. "I thought ... I didn't know." "You sent no word." "I couldn't," Thomas said simply. "Not at first. I was. I couldn't." He moved toward her, and she realized he was limping slightly, as if favoring an injury. "I've come to tell you what happened. I've come to try to explain." They went inside the cottage, and Margaret made tea, a small ritual of hospitality that had become so much more precious over the years when hospitality had seemed impossible. As they sat, Thomas told her his story. He had fled Thornwick in January of 1349, he said, after Catherine and Edmund had died. He'd gone to stay with Catherine's sister in London, thinking that the city would be far enough from the plague, that his family's deaths were something particular to the country, that London, with its size and wealth, might have already built resistance to the pestilence. Instead, he'd found that London was a charnel house. The plague was there far more devastating, even than it had been in Thornwick, killing people in the thousands, dying so fast that there wasn't time to bury them properly. Wasn't time to grieve, wasn't time to do anything, but watch as the city consumed itself from the inside. "I thought the city would be safer," Thomas said, and there was a note of almost childlike desperation in his voice, as if by repeating this, he might make it true retroactively. "I thought that wealth and size meant safety. Instead, I found that both wealth and size made it worse. There were people dying in every alley, in every house. The stench? Margaret, there are not enough words in the language to describe the smell of that many corpses decaying. Margaret, he had tried to help at first," he explained. He had used what resources he had to try to assist the dying, to try to ease their suffering. But resources meant very little when death was coming so fast that supplies could not keep up with the need. "I failed everyone," Thomas said. "Everyone I tried to help died anyway. And eventually, I realized that I was destroying myself in the attempt. I had nothing left, no money, no health, no sanity. I was sitting in the street among the corpses and the flies, and I couldn't remember why I was still alive when everyone around me was dead." He had fled London then, he said. He had taken to the roads, traveling from place to place, sometimes finding shelter in barns or monasteries, sometimes sleeping in the open. He had been sick twice. He'd contracted the plague again, and twice, by some miracle or curse, he had recovered. "I thought perhaps God was saving me for something," he said, "for some purpose. Or perhaps he was saving me so that I could suffer longer, so that I could carry the knowledge of all that death for as long as possible." For 3 years, he had wandered. He had made a kind of living as a laborer, doing whatever work came to hand. He had tried to reconnect with his old networks of trade, but most of them had dissolved in the plague. He had slowly become someone different from who he'd been before, harder, colder, but also perhaps more real. "I heard about 2 years ago that Thornwick had survived," Thomas said, "that it still existed, that people were living there again. I heard that you were still alive. But I didn't come immediately because I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" Margaret asked. "Afraid that I would be unwelcome. Afraid that the people I'd left behind would blame me for abandoning them. Afraid that I would see your face and lose what little courage I've managed to construct since then. And afraid that if I came back, I would have to acknowledge what happened. And I wasn't ready to do that yet." They sat in silence for a long moment. Margaret reached across the small table and took her brother's hand. His hand was calloused and worn, the hand of someone who'd done physical labor for years, not the soft merchant's hand she remembered. "What changed?" she asked. "What made you come now?" "I heard a story," Thomas said, "from a traveler passing through a village I was working in. He told about a place, a village called Thornwick, where people had begun lighting candles in their windows at night. He said it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. The whole village lit up with remembrance and hope, all at once. He said it was a sign that humanity hadn't entirely been destroyed by the plague." Thomas looked at Margaret, and his eyes were wet with tears. "I realized that whatever I'd run from, whatever I'd failed to do or be, I needed to come home. I needed to see those candles. I needed to understand what it meant that people could continue, that they could remember and still move forward. So I came." Margaret embraced her brother then, and they held each other like two people who'd been torn apart by time and distance and grief, and were only now, with difficulty, being rewoven back together. "The candles are beautiful," Margaret told him. "And yes, they represent hope. But they also represent survival, simple, stubborn survival. The choice to continue even when everything suggests that continuing is pointless. You've done that, Thomas. "You survived. So did you," he said. "More than that, you helped others survive. That woman in the village, Elizabeth, she's alive because you cared for her. The young lord told me that he is rebuilding the village based on principles that came from your guidance. You took the plague and you turned it into something other than just death." "I did very little," Margaret said. "I simply was here. I simply showed up when people needed someone to show up. That's everything," Thomas said. "That's the only thing that ever matters." Thomas stayed in Thornwick for the summer. He helped with the planting and the tending of crops. He worked with old John the blacksmith, slowly rebuilding the skills he'd had before the plague had interrupted his life. He spent time with Elizabeth Webster, telling her stories about London and about his years of wandering, stories that fascinated her with their particular combination of danger and despair and the stubborn human capacity to persist. And every evening as darkness fell, he would stand in the window of Margaret S. cottage and watch as the candles were lit throughout the village, one by one, until Thornwick was transformed into a constellation of small lights burning against the darkness. "It's like a prayer," Thomas said one evening, "but not a prayer to God, a prayer to ourselves maybe, a prayer to the future." "It's a memorial," Margaret said, "but one that acknowledges that the future still exists. We're saying, we remember the dead and we will live for them." By late August, Thomas had made a decision. He wanted to stay in Thornwick. He wanted to rebuild his merchant business, but in a different form, not driven by profit or accumulation, but focused on facilitating trade that would help the village and the surrounding communities recover. The young lord, who had come to greatly respect Thomas over the course of the summer, granted him permission to establish a new trading post in the village center. "It's time to move forward," Thomas told Margaret one evening as they sat in her garden, watching the summer light linger long into the evening. "Not to forget what happened, but to build something new. And I want to do it here, with you, in the place where it all fell apart." As autumn approached, Thornwick entered a new phase. It was no longer merely recovering from the plague. It was slowly and with caution, but also with genuine hope, beginning to build something new. The young lord commissioned more building projects. The fields were more productive than they'd been in years, as if the soil had somehow recovered from the weight of so many deaths. Young people were beginning to marry again, to establish families, to imagine futures that extended beyond mere survival. And the candles continued to burn. Margaret sometimes wondered if future generations would understand what they meant, these candles in the windows. Would children born after the plague had passed understand that they were memorials, tokens of survival, assertions of the continuity of life? Or would they simply see them as a quaint tradition, a custom without meaning, something done because it had always been done? She thought it probably didn't matter. The meaning was there now, embedded in the act itself. Whether future generations understood it or not, the candles would continue to burn. And in burning, they would continue to say what needed to be said. We were here, we survived, and we carry forward. By the end of 1351, Thornwick had genuinely begun to recover. The population had stabilized at around 300 people less than half of what it had been before the plague, but stable. Enough to sustain itself, enough to support the basic structures of community, enough to imagine a future. The church was repaired and had regular services again. The marketplace had expanded and now attracted traders from neighboring villages. The fields were producing enough surplus that the village had begun to accumulate stores, not just enough to survive the winter, but enough to represent possibility and choice. And everywhere, visible in the gathering darkness of late autumn and early winter, the candles burned. Margaret was 33 years old. She had survived her husband's death, the plague, the transformation of her village, and the slow reclamation of hope. She was beginning to suspect that she might actually grow old. This realization was strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once. One evening in December, as she was lighting the candle that had become such an essential part of her daily ritual. She found herself thinking about the nature of memory, how the plague had tried to erase Thornwick and had almost succeeded, how the people had begun to rebuild even in the darkness, and had used literal light in the form of candles to mark their presence and their persistence. She thought about Thomas, wandering for 3 years before he found his way home. She thought about Elizabeth, hiding in her dead parents' house and then slowly learning to live again. She thought about old John the blacksmith, and the carpenter, and the baker, and all the others who'd chosen to continue, even when continuing seemed impossible. And she thought about the people who hadn't survived, those whose names were fading, those whose faces she could no longer quite recall, those whose deaths had carved away a part of the world and left a gap that nothing could entirely fill. The candles couldn't bring them back. The rebuilding couldn't erase what had happened. But the candles could mean something. They could say, "You mattered, and we remember. You were here, and your life meant something. And the fact that you died doesn't negate the fact that you lived." It was a small gesture, lighting a candle. But Margaret had learned during the plague that small gestures were sometimes all that stood between survival and oblivion, between hope and despair. She placed the candle in the window and watched as it caught the light of the evening sun, burning bright. Tomorrow, she knew, she would light it again, and the day after that, and the day after that, for however many days she had left to live. And other people in the village would light their candles too, and the candles would burn, and the darkness would be held at bay, at least for a while. It wasn't a solution to the plague. It wasn't a way to restore what had been lost. But it was a way of saying that the loss would not be the final word, that life would continue. That hope, stubborn, uncertain, fragile hope, could still kindle in the darkness. And perhaps, Margaret thought, that was enough. The years that followed would see Thornwick gradually transform from a village marked by plague into a place where the plague was historical, a thing that had happened rather than a thing that was still happening. The memory never fully faded. It couldn't, with so many of the survivors bearing visible marks of their losses, but it became less consuming, less the defining fact of every day. Thomas established his trading post, and over time became a respected merchant again. He never remarried. He'd made peace with that loss, had decided that the energy he'd once invested in family and commerce could be better spent on rebuilding the community that had broken him and then slowly put him back together. He and Margaret grew closer over the years, finding in each other a kind of understanding that only two people who survived the plague could have. Elizabeth Webster, the girl who'd lit a candle in her dead parents' window, grew into a young woman. She helped maintain the saplings that the young lord had planted, and over time became the keeper of those trees, watching them grow, tending them through disease and drought, knowing that she was creating something that would outlive her, just as her ancestors had created Thornwick, which had outlived the plague. The young Lord Thomas, who would eventually be known as Thomas of Thornwick, became one of the more progressive leaders of his region, known for his relatively enlightened treatment of his tenants and his investment in rebuilding after plague and other disasters. He would eventually marry and have children, and would pass to them not a village that was merely trying to survive, but one that was actively trying to build something better. Old John the blacksmith trained his surviving son to take over his business, and the smithy continued to be the heart of the village, where news was exchanged and communal problems were solved over the warmth of the forge. The baker's wife, who'd survived the plague with her 2 youngest children, saw her household grow again as her children married and had children of their own, and the candles continued to burn. Margaret lived to be an old woman. She became, over time, more and more of a legend in Thornwick, the woman who'd survived the plague, who'd helped others survive it, who'd lit a candle and transformed it into a symbol of hope. Children born long after the plague had passed would ask their grandmothers about her, And the stories would grow and transform, losing some accuracy, but gaining a kind of poetic truth that perhaps mattered more than mere facts. She died quietly in her sleep in the year 1378, at the age of 56, having lived through the plague's first terrible years and seen the village through its recovery. Thomas was with her at the end, as was Elizabeth, now a woman with her own cottage and her own life, though still carrying the marks of what she'd endured in her youth. The day after Margaret died, the village did something it had never done before. Every household lit a candle at midday and kept it burning all day, and lit it again at night, burning it continuously for 3 days in memorial. The candles burned together in daylight and darkness, a constellation of light that the whole village could see, and it was said that, on those 3 days, Thornwick burned so bright that people from neighboring villages came to see it, not understanding what it meant, but understanding that it meant something, that it was a kind of prayer, a kind of testimony, a kind of love. 670 years later, in the year 2021, an archaeologist named Dr. Sarah Chun was studying the remains of villages in England that had been affected by the Black Death. She was examining Thornwick, or what remained of it. It had been abandoned by the 16th century as populations shifted and new towns became more attractive, when she discovered something unusual. She found the remains of hundreds of candle stubs, carefully preserved in the soil near where the cottages had been. Not one or two, but hundreds, stretching across several decades of occupation. And there were marks on the stone windowsills where candles had been placed repeatedly, year after year, until they'd worn grooves into the rock. In her report, Dr. Chun wrote, "The evidence suggests that the village of Thornwick engaged in some form of ritual burning of candles, beginning sometime around 1351 and continuing for at least 50 years thereafter. The widespread nature of these artifacts suggests that this was not a personal practice, but a community practice shared among many households. The purpose of this practice is unclear, but it may have represented a kind of memorial to plague victims, or a form of collective psychological healing after trauma. What is clear is that this was a deliberate, sustained practice that mattered enough to the community that they maintained it consistently over decades." Dr. Chun's report was published in an academic journal. It was read by scholars of the plague, by historians of medieval England, by people interested in how communities process trauma and grief, and it generated considerable discussion about the nature of hope and healing, about the ways that people create meaning in the face of overwhelming loss. But none of the scholars who read the report would ever know the real story. They would never know about Margaret Ashford standing in her garden, deciding to light a candle. They would never know about Elizabeth Webster hiding in her dead parents' house, lighting a candle as a signal of her survival. They would never know about Thomas Ashford returning to his home after 3 years of wandering, and seeing the candles burning and understanding that humanity hadn't entirely been destroyed. What they would know was that candles had burned in Thornwick, that people had maintained this practice for decades, that there had been something in the human spirit that, even faced with overwhelming death and loss, had insisted on marking the survival with light. And perhaps that was all that mattered. Perhaps the details didn't matter as much as the fact of it, the fact that people had survived and had memorialized their survival, and had continued to do so year after year, until the practice had become a fixture of the community, a shared ritual that bound the living together and held the memory of the dead. The candles had burned in Thornwick, and because they had burned, because people had maintained them, because the practice had lasted long enough to leave physical traces in the archaeological record, we know that something survived the plague that death had tried to destroy. We know that hope can kindle in darkness. We know that people can continue even when everything suggests they should not. We know that the human capacity to create meaning, to mark significance with light, to remember and to build and to persist, that this capacity is stronger than we often give it credit for being. And we know that in Thornwick, in the year 1351, When the bells had stopped ringing for the dead, and the candles began to burn in the windows,